Some really interesting research coming out of skeptic.com, the Skeptic Research Center and the Worldview Foundation's research team. This is really interesting, and again, something that I've wanted to talk about for a very long time, and something that I think more people should be aware of, which is depression and political ideology. Interestingly, in 2021, a Manhattan Institute report found, among other things, that reading social justice scholarship significantly reduced Black Americans' hopefulness and motivation. The author of the report speculated that though intended to empower women and racial minorities, misleading characterizations of America as a white supremacist patriarchy may do the exact opposite. In light of this possibility in this report, we asked, how is mental health related to believing this popular political rhetoric? Well, it seems pretty obvious, right? So if you paint this picture that the world is ending, that you as a Black person, you as a woman, you will have limited life earnings, you will have limited opportunities, you will have limited life chances as it relates to your white heterosexual male peer, that's a very depressing outlook. Regardless of the statistics, that's just depressing, period. So the research here shows that cynical beliefs about life in America for racial minorities are more common than cynical beliefs about life for women. This is interesting. Cynical beliefs about life in America for women and racial minorities were most common among liberal respondents. Again, very not surprising there. We know that liberal ideology focuses on group identity and the challenges of group identity. So that's not necessarily surprising. Here is some surprising statistics that this research found. Those who agreed or strongly agreed that racial minorities in the US have no hope for success because of racism were moderately depressed. Racial minorities have no hope for success because of racism were moderately depressed. As well, those who agree that women in the United States have no hope for success because of sexism were moderately depressed, right? It's this idea that the weight of the world, there's just way too much happening. Of course, right? It's not too challenging to see how that couldn't be the case. Gen Z participants identifying as very liberal or very conservative were moderately depressed, as were very liberal millennials. So basically this is saying, when you take very liberal, very conservative Gen Z participants in the study, they're moderately depressed. And again, that makes sense to me because if you think about it, if you're very conservative, very liberal, you probably only see the issues in our society, the big issues, and you're probably less likely to think that there's a middle ground or that there is some hope for our current politicians and our current discourse. When asked, cynical beliefs by political orientation. So women in the United States have no hope for success because of sexism. If you are very liberal, you're going to agree with that statement, or at least respondents who were very liberal agreed with that statement. Women in the United States have no hope for sexism in higher percentages than liberals, moderates, conservatives, or very conservatives. Very liberal agreed with that statement as well. Very liberal respondents agreed with the phrase, racial minorities in the US have no hope for success because of racism. Both statements are very cynical, right? There's no hope for success because of sexism for women, racism for racial minorities. If you're very liberal, you will agree, the respondents agreed in much higher percentages and much higher numbers. So that's really interesting. Scroll down further, race, cynicism, and depression. So again, that very challenging or very negative, cynical statement. Racial minorities in the US have no hope for success because of racism. Well, if you agree with that, if you strongly agree with that, you are considered moderately depressed. Now, I'm not sure what scale this is using, but it's interesting to see that that is actually what's happening here. So if you strongly agree with the phrase racial minorities in the US have no hope for success because of racism, chances are you're moderately depressed. And again, that makes sense. It's a very cynical statement. And if you strongly agree with the cynical statement, chances are you yourself feel this hopelessness in society. And the same is true, in fact, more so true for the statement, women in the United States have no hope for success because of sexism. This one's interesting because sex cynicism and depression indicate that if you strongly agree with that statement, you can actually have severe depression. Again, women in the US have no hope for success because of sexism. Respondents who strongly agreed with that statement had severe depression rates. Very interesting. And again, it makes sense to me. Okay. Another interesting finding from this research shows depression based on political orientation and generation. So what we see here is, now these different lines refer to generation. Boomers are the black line, Gen X green, millennial blue, and Gen Z red. So you can see boomers generally, regardless if they're very liberal or very conservative, they have generally lower levels of depression. That's interesting. I guess boomers are probably just like, okay, this is the way it is, you know? Whereas when we look at Gen Xers, they're slightly more. Millennials, much more higher on the depression scale. And again, if you are very liberal or very conservative, you just have higher levels of depression. And then Gen Xers, or Gen Z, also have exceptionally higher levels, moderate levels of depression. So we can see in general, Gen Z have moderate depression levels here, unless they are moderates or slightly conservative. If they're very conservative, liberal, or very liberal, they suffer from higher level, moderate depression. Now, I will say as a contextual piece to this for Gen Z is it could also be the economy, right? Like housing is a big issue for Gen Z. They complete a few degrees. Who knows what their job prospects are like, and who knows if they'll be able to afford a home. So all of that can be contributing as well to their levels of depression that they're also facing, unlike any other generation before. And every other generation before has sold this kind of dream of get your education, get a degree, and then get a home. The more extreme your politics, it seems, the more extreme you agree with these cynical statements, the more likely you will have moderate levels of depression. Now, what I wanted to do with this is explore this some more. People who strongly agree with these very extreme statements may have friends who further that perspective, right? They may be in their own echo chamber as well. And because they're in their own echo chamber, they're reinforcing those cynical views of racism and sexism. Now, I'm not saying that those don't exist, but I often wonder, and this is a thought experiment, if that person had a friend group that was made up of women and racial minorities who were very successful or moderately successful or successful, however we want to determine that, in society, or whose families were successful, would that person still strongly agree with those statements? Would they agree, maybe even slightly disagree with those statements? And if that's the case, would that address that level of depression that they may be facing? So one thing that has been found when young people in particular go to universities, I did a podcast on affirmative action, and affirmative action said that, there needs to be more racial diversity on college campuses. What universities have found is when that is the case, when there's more racial diversity, many groups from racial minorities stick to those groups. Black students stay with Black students, Latino students stay with Latino students, other racial minorities stay with other racial minorities. There's less likelihood of cross-race friend groups forming. And that's not necessarily surprising, but that's interesting that the goal of intermixing because of all these different races on school campuses may actually further segregate students into groups that they're part of. Of course, again, there needs to be more studies on that, but that's some of the interesting findings that some researchers have found. And so that lets me know that perhaps students and people in general were just not good at making friends with people who have different opinions than us. We're more likely to make friends who share our perspectives, who have similar backgrounds, who may share in the cynicism that we have towards life. And we're less likely to engage in discussion with people who have different opinions. So here's some research, and this is some research from Dr. Bahn, who's a behavioral psychologist. Dr. Angela Bahn has researched studying diverse friendships. So Dr. Bahn's data suggests that in answer to her main research question, people's beliefs about diversity do predict their friendship choices. However, her findings highlight the complex nature of this relationship. People who reported valuing diversity were likely to have diverse friendships as defined by race, religion, and sexual orientation. In contrast, when it came to attitudes and values, positive diversity beliefs were associated with choosing similar friends. Pairs who valued diversity highly were the most likely to share similar attitudes and values. For the participants in Dr. Bahn's research, it seems valuing diversity did not apply to diversity of thought. This is noted as a potential area for future study. So, the data was consistent with the hypotheses that valuing diversity influences friendship choices the most, amplified the effect of diversity beliefs on friendship choices. Okay, very interesting. Diverse friendships are more likely to form in smaller groups, smaller communities. Seeking diverse friendships can be helped or hindered by the characteristics of the surrounding community. Very interesting. So, while those who are seeking diversity in friendships based on race, religion, and sexual orientation, they'll find it. They will definitely find that diversity in friendship based on those factors. But they are very unlikely to find friends who do not share their attitudes and values. So the diversity of race, religion, and sexual orientation are there, but diversity of thought is not. And that to me is such an interesting revelation, research finding, etc. That gives me like all these kind of like ideas about explaining why people have these cynical views and that link to moderate depression. It's so obvious because if you have those cynical views, you're most likely surrounded with people who share those cynical views, most likely, leading to your feelings of moderate depression. So the antidote could be surround yourself with people who don't share those opinions. And we see this every day. There are many political actors who suffer from depression. Right before I started this, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole looking at this, and AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, speaks out on mental health and Latinx trauma post-Trump. So right there, that headline alone, we can start piecing together that AOC, I'm not saying that she has depression, she very well could, but mental health and Latinx trauma post-Trump, right? So there could it very well could be the case that AOC has very cynical views about the way in which society is going, the way in which society is headed, leading to her own mental health. And AOC's been very open. It says AOC's openness to help combat the added shame around mental illness can come from within Latinx communities themselves. There's a big fear of being labeled crazy and a disdain for those who wash their dirty laundry in front of strangers. Yes, there is a stigma in many communities for talking about mental health. But you think about that in relation to AOC's own personal views. Here's an example. The constant terror, the way in which this article is written is also crazy. The constant terror created by the Trump administration's anti-immigration stance, as well as the pandemic, took a particular toll on her district. You can even see that the way in which the author is writing may also indicate that this person believes the cynicism that exists. It was just an assault. And for a community that's 50% immigrant, that has real high concentration of essential workers, where we have mixed status families, these federal policies that even Democrats champion don't help us. We're excluded from them due to just political convenience narratives. So you can already see from AOC's viewpoint and the way in which she structures the reality of politics in the United States, there is this sense of hopelessness. There's this sense of, it's been so traumatic. It was an assault. We've been at the mercy of this terrorist president kind of thing. That lends itself to that cynicism. And it's not just on the left. I remember reading that Alex Jones had suffered from all types of mental health issues. Back in 2011, he was interviewed by Rolling Stone, and Jones openly talked about some of the issues he's had growing up. For such an angry guy, the barrel-chested Jones has a surprisingly jolly presence. Off-air, his gravel pit voice softens to crack jokes with his young staff. He attends a Methodist church on Sundays. Any rage left over from his show appears reserved from the black Dodge Charger. And then Jones says, people think I'm depressive and angry, but it's the opposite. My life is a love letter to humanity. What the globalists do is a hate letter, a curse. So right there, again, very similar to what we saw in the earlier research, right? People think I'm depressive and angry, but it's the opposite. My life is a love letter to humanity. What the globalists do is a hate letter, a curse. So Jones, similarly to AOC, is painting this picture of us versus them, that there is this war happening. And I'm on the side of good, and I'm fighting for what's good. The other side just wants hate and nothing more. And so to combat that, I am going to put out, in fact, his whole website, InfoWars. InfoWars. The operative word there is war. It's in his company's name. He's at war to fight that oppressor. So while he may have very strong conservative views, or very strong, the idea of libertarian views, I can see how Alex Jones and AOC could both suffer from some level of depression, moderate or severe, because in their minds, the entire social and political order is out of touch, out of order, and there's no hope. There's less and less hope as a result. And so I think the way in which both AOC and Alex Jones can combat that, again, they're extreme, and I don't know if they do this or not, but it's about surrounding yourself with people who disagree with you. Because my sense, and I don't know this to be true, but my sense is that if you have people around you that openly disagree with you and can challenge you in a very respectful way, and people who you respect, chances are you may not have as cynical view of the structure of our political order, because you perhaps see the success that some people are engaging in. Now, whether or not that relates to your own personal views, and whether or not that relates to how you understand success to be, is a separate conversation. But my thinking is, the more you surround yourself with women, racial minorities, and just people who are successful, chances are you'll agree less with those statements stated at the beginning of the stream, and you'll probably be more likely to understand the possibilities within the political and social order. And potentially you'll feel this less of a burden of what the research is showing, and that somehow you individually must correct it. Because I think that's also another fallacy. I think that some people believe that there's no hope because I alone can't fix or correct the system. And it's like, it's not on you alone, it's on the collective. And there are things you can do, small steps you can do that are beneficial. So, all that said, very interesting research. I kind of agree with the premise and I kind of substantiates what I've already thought. But I'd love to see more research done on people who have friends of different opinions and their mental state. I'll tell you personally, most every one of my friends I disagree with. And I'm not saying that I have this perfect mental state. I definitely don't. But I will say that my friends who I disagree with have pushed me to be more thoughtful in my own disagreement and pushed me away from the extreme, right? And pushed me more towards, okay, help me understand a little bit more. And I hope that I've done that to them as well. I hope that through my podcast and my social media, that they themselves have benefited or at least had some aha moments when thinking about politics. So that was some really interesting research that I found. I want to share that with you. If you haven't already, definitely follow me at Open Minds Podcast on Instagram. Check me out there. My website should be updated, openmindspodcast.com. I will be editing this stream and posting it on my YouTube as well. I'll try to do that tonight. So if you missed anything, check it out there. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is a wonderful stream. And I'm trying to get better at these things. So let me know how I did in the chat below. Thanks, everyone. And I'll definitely catch you in the next one.